The Coos County Sheriff's patrol boat came alongside my pontoon at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late May, 3 feet of glassy water between his bow rail and my fender, my fishing pole in the rod holder, and a blonde woman in the bow seat in white linen pants smiling at her phone. The deputy said,
"Sir, Mrs. McKinney here has filed a complaint that you're operating an unpermitted vessel on the community lake. Could you produce your registration and your HO Marina sticker?"
I unlocked my phone. I held up a photograph of the deed to the Hargreaves family parcel, recorded in 1924, which includes by metes and bounds every drop of water the complaint had just been filed about. The deputy looked at me. He looked at the woman in the bow seat. He said,
"Mrs. McKinney, I am going to step away and call my sergeant."
Inside of 48 hours, by means of one phone call to my old law firm in Boston, I was going to own her HOA's marina. I came back to the family farm in Errol, New Hampshire, in early May of 2024, 18 months after my wife Bridget drowned off Cushing Island in Casco Bay, during a squall that came up faster than anybody on the water that afternoon had been ready for. The Coast Guard pulled her body out of the water at 7:14 the next morning. I had been on the dock at our place in Falmouth Fourside, where we had sailed from. The Coast Guard captain who came up to me afterward had been a friend of my father's. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Colin, I am so sorry." Bridget had been a children's book illustrator. She had been 40 years old when we met at a charity auction in Boston in 1986, the year I made associate at the firm, and she had been 63 when she went into the water. We had 2 children. Our son Declan was 32. Our daughter Maeve was 29. Bridget had illustrated 41 books across 34 years, 3 of them New York Times bestsellers, and the wall of her studio in our Falmouth Fourside house was covered in framed original watercolors of the loons and bobcats and old porches of northern New England. She had been planning, the autumn before she died, to start a series of watercolor paintings of Hargreaves Pond. The first painting was on her easel when she left for the sailing trip. It was a study of the morning mist rising off the eastern cove at 5:47 a.m. The painting is in my study now. I have not been able to look at it without crying for 11 months. I look at it most mornings anyway. I am Colin Hargreaves, 64 years old, retired managing partner and chief operating officer of Meridian Real Estate Partners, a Boston-based commercial property law firm I joined out of Harvard Law in 1985 and stayed at for 38 years. My specialty was ground leases. If you have ever rented the dirt under a hotel, a marina, a ski resort, or a private airstrip anywhere from Bar Harbor to Bridgeport between 1989 and 2023, there is a non-zero chance my office drafted the document under your floor. I personally structured 312 ground leases in my career. 214 of them were on waterfront. 46 of them remain in force on my watch. I came home to Errol because the only place that did not have Bridget's ghost in every corner was the front porch of the farmhouse my great-grandfather had built in 1924 on the western shore of Hargreaves Pond. The pond is 31 acres of spring-fed New Hampshire water, sitting in a granite bowl at 1,200 feet of elevation in northern Coos County, 6 miles north of the village of Errol, on a private gravel road called Loon Spit Lane. My great-grandfather bought the original 240 acres around the pond in 1924 for $930 cash, after the granite company in Berlin had closed and the land had reverted to the state for back taxes. He bought another 400 acres across the next 20 years. By the time my father inherited the farm in 1968, the Hargreaves family owned 612 acres around Hargreaves Pond, and we own the lake. We have always owned the lake. New Hampshire is one of the states in the country where a body of water surrounded entirely by single ownership remains private property of the riparian deed holder. The original 1924 deed, recorded at the Coos County Registry of Deeds in Lancaster, New Hampshire, in Plat Book 3, page 11, conveys to my great-grandfather the entirety of the pond known locally as Loon Spit Pond, including all waters thereof, and the lake bed in fee simple. My father renamed it Hargreaves Pond in 1971 because his mother had been a Hargreaves before she married a Cunliffe, and he wanted his mother's name on the water. In 1998, my father, who was 80 and dying of congestive heart failure, sold 80 acres on the eastern shore to a developer named Camden Fry, who built a planned community on it called Birchwood Cove Estates, 60 homes. The buyers were doctors and lawyers from Concord, Manchester, and Portsmouth who wanted a summer place. The developer's sales materials promised shared lake access, language my father had insisted be carefully circumscribed in the actual deed. The Birchwood Cove Estates buyers were granted, under the recorded covenants, a non-exclusive personal use license to launch boats and swim at the Eastern Cove from May 1st to October 15th, and nothing else. In 2001, 3 years before my father died, I personally drafted a 50-year ground lease on a 4-acre parcel of the Eastern Shore between the Hargreaves family and the newly formed Birchwood Cove Estates Homeowners Association. The HOA wanted to build a small community marina. My father wanted to be neighborly. The rent was $1 per year. The lease ran until December 31st, 2051. I drafted it myself at my office on State Street in Boston on a Wednesday afternoon in March, and I included, in Section 11.4, the kind of carefully worded acceleration clause that a young man who had spent 10 years drafting waterfront ground leases knew to include in any document involving a body of water his own family owned. For 23 years, that lease worked exactly as it was supposed to work. The original Birchwood Cove Board was made up of 7 retired school teachers, a Methodist pastor, and a chemistry professor from the University of New Hampshire who spent his summers at the Cove and his winters at the lab. They built a modest $15,000 wooden dock with 12 slips, an unpainted boathouse with a tin roof, and a small concession stand that sold ice cream and fishing tackle on summer Saturdays. The original treasurer, a retired second-grade teacher named Mrs. Adelaide Pullman, who is going to become important to this story later, kept the books in a green ledger by hand for 15 years, and walked the bank deposit slips to the Granite State Credit Union in Berlin every Friday morning at 8:14 a.m. in a 1996 Toyota Tercel. She drove until the year my father died. That community treated the lake the way my father had hoped a community would treat the lake. They picked up their litter. They watched out for the loons. They sent a flower wreath to my mother's funeral in 2003, with a card signed by every household on the Cove. My father was at the funeral with the card in his hand for the better part of the receiving line, showing every person who came through who had not yet seen it. Then the original board started dying off. The Methodist pastor retired to South Carolina in 2014. The chemistry professor died in 2016. Mrs. Pullman's husband had a stroke in 2017. The second wave of buyers came in. Younger, wealthier, hedge fund money from Boston, biotech money from Cambridge, plastic surgery money from Hartford. The new buyers built 15,000 square foot lake houses with infinity pools that pointed at my father's pond. And they tore down the original boathouse with the tin roof and replaced it with a 32-slip floating concrete marina with a yacht club restaurant on a glassed-in second story and a uniformed valet station at the bottom of the new entry road. They paid for the upgrade through a special assessment on every Birchwood Cove household. They did not consult the lessor. They did not need to under the lease, as long as they followed the original use covenants. Heather McKinney moved into Birchwood Cove Estates in the summer of 2019. She was 44, blonde down to her elbows, white Lexus SUV, married to a Manchester real estate broker named Brad. She was elected president of the Birchwood Cove HOA in 2020 on a platform of elevating the community. Across the next 4 years, she had built the marina parcel into something that began, by 2024, to look less like a $15,000 wooden dock and more like the kind of yacht club that has a uniformed valet on summer weekends. She had also, very quietly, started behaving like a person who believed she owned the lake. I did not introduce myself to her when I moved back to the farm in May. I did not introduce myself, frankly, to anyone. I unloaded the U-Haul. I let my old dog Murphy out into the meadow. I sat on the porch, and I looked at the water for 2 weeks. I had met Heather exactly once, at the village store in Errol, on my 3rd morning back. I had come in for coffee and a Boston Sunday Globe. She had been at the counter buying a bag of pre-cut crudités and a bottle of Pinot Grigio at 9 in the morning. She had looked at me the way a person who has been in a small town for 5 years looks at a face she does not recognize. She had not asked who I was. I had not told her. She had paid for her crudités. She had left. I had recognized her. I had been getting the Birchwood Cove HOA newsletter, forwarded to my Boston office by Patty Crandall, the secretary at my father's request, since 2018. Heather's photograph appeared on the masthead of every issue since her election. I knew her name. I knew her face. I knew her husband's name. I knew, from a brief item in the spring 2023 newsletter, that the marina's annual gala had quietly become an invitation-only event 2 years earlier. I had not thought much of it at the time. My wife had been alive then. On the 15th day, I put the pontoon in. The pontoon was a 1989 Crest 3 my father had bought new in Bangor in March of that year. Dark green hull, beige canvas top, gas line a little finicky in the cold, but a reliable old engine that started on the third pull. He had taught me to fish off that boat in 1974. He had taught my son Declan to fish off it in 1997. I had not had it on the water in 3 years. I put it in at our shore. I motored out to the middle of the lake. I cut the engine. I baited a hook. I sat in the late spring sun. It was on that fishing trip, an hour and 22 minutes later, that the sheriff's boat came alongside. Deputy Ezra Beaudry was 28 years old, in his second year on the Coos County Sheriff's Office. Brown uniform, polite face, the kind of small-town deputy who had become a deputy because his uncle ran the bait shop in Colebrook. He had not been on the job long enough to know the Hargreaves family by name. He had been on the job exactly long enough to know that he should call his sergeant before doing anything with a complaint that had a deed problem in it. He stepped back to the stern of his patrol boat. He called his sergeant on his shoulder radio. I watched Heather McKinney smile at her phone in the bow seat while the deputy did this. She did not smile at me. She did not look at me. She did not appear to consider me a person who was relevant to her afternoon. The deputy came back forward at 4:54 p.m. He said, "Sir, my sergeant has asked me to inform Mrs. McKinney that this is a civil matter, and her complaint will need to be addressed through the Coos County Superior Court if she wishes to pursue it. Sir, I apologize for the disruption to your afternoon." I said, "Deputy, no apology is necessary. Could I ask you one question for the record?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Have you, in your capacity as a peace officer of Coos County, been formally notified by Mrs. McKinney that she has filed this complaint in her official role as president of the Birchwood Cove Estates Homeowners Association?" The deputy looked at Heather McKinney. The deputy said, "Sir, Mrs. McKinney identified herself as the HOA president when she called the office at 3:48 p.m. We have her statement on the call recording." I said, "Thank you, deputy. That will be helpful." Heather McKinney finally looked up from her phone. She said, Mr. Hargreaves, is it? You should know that as the president of this community, I take my responsibilities seriously. Whatever the deed situation, the people who live on this lake have community standards. I would suggest you reach out to my office at the marina to discuss properly registering your vessel with the HOA. I will have the paperwork sent to your home." I did not respond. I picked up my fishing pole. I reeled in. I started the engine. I motored back to my shore at exactly the same speed I had motored out at, which is to say, not quickly. When I got home, I made a cup of coffee, sat at my father's kitchen table, and pulled the original 2001 Birchwood Cove Estates ground lease out of the filing cabinet I had moved up from my Boston office 2 weeks earlier. I read it twice. Section 11.4 was exactly where I had left it 23 years earlier. I sat at the table for a long time after I finished reading. The pond was still outside the kitchen window. The sun had set behind the granite ridge on the western shore. A loon called once, somewhere out on the open water. The long, minor key descending note that means a male loon is checking on his mate. Murphy was asleep at my feet. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I thought about my father. I thought about the morning in March of 2001, when he had come to my office on State Street and sat in the chair across from my desk and asked me to draft the lease. He had been 78. He had been retired from his accounting practice for 9 years by then. He had been wearing the brown corduroy jacket my mother had bought him in 1986 because she said it made him look like Robert Frost. He had not gotten rid of the jacket after she died. He had not gotten rid of much. He had said to me that morning, "Colin, I want to be neighborly to these folks. They are buying summer places. They are not trying to take advantage, but I want the lease to be careful. I want the lease to be the kind of lease that protects the lake if somebody ever forgets they are a guest." I had drafted Section 11.4 to my father's specifications. He had signed it on March 27, 2001, 3 weeks before our daughter Maeve was born and 6 weeks before my mother's birthday. He had handed me his Cross fountain pen to use, the one my mother had given him for their 20th anniversary. I still have the pen. It is in my study now, in the same drawer as the affidavit of breach. The next morning at 7:14 a.m., I called Marcus Highland on his cell phone. Marcus is 57, the current managing partner at Meridian Real Estate Partners, my successor in that role, and the closest thing to a younger brother I have ever had. He has been with the firm since 1996. He has known me since the day he interviewed at age 24. He picked up on the second ring. Marcus, pull file MRP-2001-0142. The Birchwood Cove Estates ground lease. I need you to read section 11.4 back to me, and then I need you to do something for me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Colin, tell me the HOA up there has done something. I said, Marcus, the HOA up here has done several things. The first of them was filing a complaint with the Coos County Sheriff's Office at 3:48 p.m. yesterday afternoon, in the President's official capacity, on community letterhead. Could you please read me section 11.4? I heard the sound of Marcus walking across his office. I heard the file drawer open. I heard the sound of paper. He read me section 11.4. He read it slowly. He read it the way Marcus reads any contract, which is one phrase at a time, in the tone of a man who has been a real estate attorney for 31 years and has finally learned that the people who lose lawsuits are the people who skim. I have known him long enough that I could picture him at his desk on State Street while he read, left elbow on the blotter, right hand pinching the bridge of his nose where his reading glasses sit, his coffee mug from the Massachusetts Bar Association at his elbow, with the picture of his late golden retriever Otto on the side. It said exactly what I had drafted it to say in March of 2001, 3 weeks before our daughter Maeve was born. In the event of any material breach by lessee, including but not limited to A. Failure to pay rent, B. Initiation of any legal action or law enforcement complaint by lessee, its officers, or its agents against lessor, his heirs, assigns, or guests, in connection with their use or enjoyment of the pond, except in the case of bona fide emergency. C. Interference with lessor's quiet enjoyment of the lake or its environs. D. Failure to permit lessor's free use of the marina facilities, including the lakeside restaurant and slip access, at no charge to lessor or his immediate family. The lessor may, upon 30 days written notice of default and absent cure within said period, declare this lease forfeited. Upon forfeiture, all improvements upon the demised premises shall revert to lessor without compensation. Marcus was quiet for a long minute after he read it. Then he said, Colin, are we saying she breached B? I said, Marcus, she breached B yesterday at 3:48 p.m. with the call to the sheriff. I expect she will breach A something else in the next 10 days. I do not need to wait for it. I need you to draft a formal notice of default by close of business today. Send it from your office under our firm's letterhead, and serve it by certified mail. I will personally serve a courtesy copy in hand at the Marina office tomorrow morning at 9. The 30-day cure period starts on the date of delivery. He said, Colin, are you sure about this? There is no walking it back. I said, Marcus, I drafted section 11.4 in 2001 because my father told me, the week before we signed the lease, that a community is judged by how it treats its weakest neighbor. The lake is the weakest neighbor I have. I am not walking it back. Send the letter. He sent the letter at 4:11 p.m. that afternoon. Heather McKinney signed for it personally on her front porch at 11:14 a.m. on Thursday. She did not understand what she had just signed for. I know this because at 11:17 a.m. on Thursday, 3 minutes after the certified mail receipt was photographed by the postal carrier, Heather McKinney sent an email from her HOA president account to her HOA secretary that began with the phrase, I think the new neighbor is trying to scare us, and concluded with the words, I will not be intimidated by this man. I know this because the HOA secretary, a woman named Patty Crandall, who had been on the Birchwood Cove board for 11 years, and whose late husband had taught my younger brother how to ice fish in 1981, forwarded the email to my personal Gmail account at 11:22 a.m. with a single line of her own. Colin, Heather doesn't know what this means. I do. I have been waiting 4 years for somebody to send her this letter. I forwarded Patty's email to Marcus. I wrote, Marcus, Patty just gave us our first cooperating witness. Marcus wrote back at 11:24. Colin, tell me about Patty. I told him about Patty. Patty Crandall was 66 years old. She had been the secretary of the Birchwood Cove HOA board since 2013. Her late husband, Carl, had taught my younger brother how to ice fish in 1981 and had died of a heart attack at the bottom of his own driveway in November of 2019, 2 months after Heather McKinney had moved into Birchwood Cove. Patty had stayed on the board because, in her own words to me in a phone call later that afternoon, "Colin, somebody had to." The new people did not understand the lake. Patty had been quietly photocopying everything Heather signed for 4 years. The originals went to the HOA filing cabinet. The copies went into a banker's box on the second shelf of Patty's pantry, behind the canned tomatoes she put up every August. Patty was the kind of New Hampshire woman who, when she sees something going wrong, does not call a meeting. She makes a copy. She puts the copy in the pantry. She waits. She had been waiting since 2022. Marcus and I, by 12:30 p.m. that Thursday, had drafted a draft cooperating witness agreement on Meridian letterhead. I drove it to Patty's house at 1:14 p.m. Patty signed it on her porch. She handed me the banker's box. The banker's box contained 4 years of HOA minutes, 11 months of Marina nightly receipts, 14 consulting invoices from Birchwood Hospitality Management, LLC, and 3 separate written complaints from the Patterson-Jones family that Heather had marked resolved on the cover sheet without ever responding to. By the end of that Thursday, I had also learned from Patty that Heather McKinney had been excluding 3 families from the Marina restaurant since 2022. A black family from Concord named the Patterson-Joneses, a same-sex couple from Portsmouth named Tim and Steve, who had bought a cabin in Birchwood Cove in 2021, and an elderly retired school teacher named Mrs. Adelaide Pullman, who had been the original treasurer of the HOA in 1998 and had voted against Heather's presidency in 2020. By the end of that Thursday, I had also learned, from Patty, that the Marina's nightly receipts were running about 30% below the Marina's actual food and beverage sales, because Heather and her husband Brad had been running a side LLC called Birchwood Hospitality Management, LLC, which had been billing the Marina for consulting services since 2021 to the tune of approximately $14,000 a month. By the end of that Thursday, I had also learned from Patty that Heather had been intercepting and shredding correspondence addressed to the HOA board from any resident she did not like, including 3 complaints about her own excluded from restaurant decisions, and 1 formal letter from Mrs. Pullman threatening legal action over the discrimination. By the end of that Thursday, I had also learned, from a separate phone call to Mrs. Pullman at the suggestion of Patty, that Heather had once told her, in the Marina parking lot in front of 2 other residents in June of 2022, that the Marina restaurant is a private establishment, and we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone whose presence creates an unwelcome atmosphere for our other members. Mrs. Pullman had said, in the calm voice of a person who had taught 2nd grade for 38 years, "Heather, I am 83. I have a granddaughter who is biracial. She comes for the 4th of July. If you are telling me that my granddaughter is unwelcome at the restaurant her grandfather helped pay to build in 1998, I would like you to say it clearly." Heather had said, in front of the 2 witnesses, "Mrs. Pullman, I think we both know what kind of atmosphere we want for the community." Mrs. Pullman had walked back to her car. She had cried for the only time she had cried in public since her husband's stroke in 2017. She had driven home. She had written the letter she had then sent to the HOA board the next week, the letter Heather had pulled out of the mail slot at the Marina office and shredded without showing to any other board member. That letter, in photocopy form, was in Patty Crandall's banker's box. I added every detail to a spreadsheet. I called my son Declan in Boston on Thursday evening at 8:47 p.m. Declan is 32, a commercial litigator at Foley Hogue, and the kind of son who has been waiting for his old man to ask for something since the morning his mother drowned. He answered on the first ring. "Dad, what do you need?" I said, "Declan, I need you to take Friday off. I am going to invite you to draft the most enjoyable filing of your career." He said, "Dad, I am driving up tonight." He arrived at the farmhouse at 1:42 a.m. on Friday morning. He had a Foley Hogue overnight bag, a printout of Section 11.4, and a paper Dunkin' Donuts cup he had refilled at the toll plaza in Hooksett, because Declan has been drinking Dunkin' coffee since 2014 and will not be argued with on the point. He hugged me at the door. He took off his shoes the way Bridget had taught him to take off his shoes when he came in from the rain. He looked at the pond through the kitchen window. He said, "Dad, how are you holding up?" I said, "Declan, I am about to be busier than I have been in 2 years. I think that's going to be good for me." He said, "Dad, I think it's going to be good for both of us." We sat at my father's kitchen table for the next 40 hours. Across those 40 hours, Declan walked the entire Birchwood Cove HOA financials in chronological order on the kitchen table, with sticky notes color-coded by Bridget's old color system. Yellow for embezzlement, blue for discrimination, pink for procedural breach, green for evidence we could subpoena later. By Saturday morning, he had built a 40-page exhibits index. By Saturday afternoon, he had drafted the affidavit of breach Marcus would later sign at the firm, and the certificate of reversion the Registry of Deeds would record at 4:11 p.m. on day 31. By Sunday morning, he had drafted a draft sublease agreement for the HOA to sign post-reversion, on terms my father would have liked. Declan had not slept more than 4 hours across the 40 hours. Murphy had slept under his chair for the last 12. Across those 40 hours, 3 additional things happened. The first was that Heather McKinney, instead of curing the breach, doubled down. She filed a civil complaint in Coos County Superior Court at 4:38 p.m. on Friday afternoon, against me personally, alleging trespass on community waters, interference with HOA operations, and harassment of community residents. She did not have a New Hampshire licensed attorney sign the complaint. She had Brad sign it. Brad was not an attorney. The court clerk in Lancaster called my old college friend Walter at the Bar Association at 5:01 p.m. to make sure she should accept the filing. Walter, who I had not spoken to in 9 years, called me at 5:14 p.m. The second was that Heather, on Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m., instructed the marina manager, a young man named Trevor Olson, 26, who had been the assistant manager at the Maine Maritime Museum before taking the marina job in 2023, to physically remove me from the marina restaurant if I appeared. She also instructed Trevor to have the marina's contracted Lake Patrol, a side service Heather had introduced in 2022, consisting of a Birchwood Cove resident named Doug Brenneman in a Carolina skiff with a yellow flashing light bar she had ordered off Amazon, follow my pontoon at a 50-foot distance anytime I appeared on the water, and to photograph any infraction. Doug Brenneman, who had voted against Heather's re-election in 2023 and had not been told that until this assignment, called Patty Crandall on Saturday afternoon at 2:14 p.m. and said, "Patty, I am not following that man around the lake. I am the third witness on the chain. Tell Mr. Hargreaves I would like to give a statement." Patty patched him through to Declan at 2:21 p.m. Declan took his statement on speakerphone. Trevor told her, in language Declan and I both later read in his sworn statement, that he was not in a position to assault a 64-year-old retired attorney in the lakeside restaurant, ma'am, particularly one whose family has owned the lake since 1924, which is a fact I learned this morning from my grandmother. The third was that Patty Crandall, on Sunday afternoon, drove to my house in her 2008 Subaru Outback with a banker's box on the back seat. The box contained 4 years of HOA financial records she had been quietly photocopying since 2022 because she had known, in the way old New Hampshire women know things, that they were going to be needed. Each of those 3 things was, under Section 11.4, a separate material breach. The cure period was 26 days from the date Heather had signed the certified mail receipt. She had used 6 of them to make her situation worse on each of 3 days. I had 24 days remaining. On Monday morning at 7:47 a.m., I called Marcus again. I said, "Marcus, we are going to file the affidavit of breach on day 31. We are going to record it at the Coos County Registry of Deeds at 4:11 p.m. that afternoon, the same time, 23 years and 2 months earlier, that we recorded the original lease. We are going to send written notice of reversion to the HOA board on the morning of day 32. I am going to walk into the annual Marina Gala on the evening of day 32, which is the Saturday after Memorial Day weekend, with Declan and the marina manager Trevor and a Coos County Sheriff's Sergeant, and I am going to inform Mrs. McKinney that she is on my property and that the gala is being respectfully concluded." Marcus was quiet for a long minute. Then he said, "Colin, Bridget would be losing her mind right now." I said, "Marcus, Bridget would be making popcorn." He said, "We will be ready by Wednesday." We were ready by Tuesday afternoon. Day 28 came and went. Heather McKinney did not cure. She had retained an attorney from Concord on day 15, a man named Garrett Vanderhoeven, who specialized in HOA litigation, and had told her, on the basis of 40 minutes of phone consultation and a redacted summary of the facts she had given him, that this acceleration claim is theatrical and unenforceable, Mrs. McKinney. We can fight it for 20 months at $450 an hour. The lesser will give up before the trial. Heather had relayed this opinion to Patty Crandall in a board email on day 16, and Patty had quietly forwarded it to me at 8:14 p.m. that same evening. Garrett Vanderhoeven had not read the lease. Heather had told him there is some acceleration language, without giving him the document. Garrett, who had been practicing in Concord for 19 years, had assumed she was exaggerating, the way HOA presidents almost always exaggerate. He had not asked for a copy. Marcus and I had decided not to send him one. She did, on day 28, post a photograph of herself on the Birchwood Cove Estates community Facebook page, in a white linen dress on the marina dock at sunset, holding a champagne flute, with a caption that read, "Excited to host you all at the 2024 Birchwood Cove Annual Gala this Saturday. Private event for residents only." She did not know that her residents-only event was, by day 32, going to be held on private property she had ceased to control. She also did not know that on day 26, Declan and I had recorded the affidavit of breach with the Coos County Registry of Deeds in Lancaster. Declan had driven the original document to the registry office himself in his Honda Pilot. The recorder, a woman named Mrs. Theron, had known my father since 1973, and had read the original 1924 deed back to me on the phone 3 days earlier, when I had asked her to verify the plat book number. She handed Declan the time-stamped certificate of recording at 3:47 p.m. She said, "Tell your daddy hello from Mrs. Theron." Declan said, "Ma'am, my grandpa died in 2018. Mrs. Theron said, "I know. Tell him hello anyway." She also did not know that on day 29, Brad McKinney, her husband, had received a separate certified letter at his real estate office in Manchester from a man named Special Agent David Cho of the FBI Boston Field Office. The letter cited specific transaction records from Birchwood Hospitality Management, LLC, that suggested federal wire fraud over 4 years. The letter requested a voluntary interview. Brad, in a moment of professional self-preservation that his wife would later resent for the rest of his life, agreed. Brad had begun cooperating with the FBI by Wednesday of day 30. Heather did not know this on Saturday of day 32, when she was standing in white linen on a marina dock that had, by 4:11 p.m. the previous day, ceased to belong to her HOA and reverted to me. I parked my pontoon at the marina dock at 7:14 p.m. on Saturday. The boat was clean. Trevor had washed it on Friday afternoon at the marina dock at my request, which was, in retrospect, the first action a Birchwood Cove employee had ever taken in the service of a Hargreaves family member, at no charge. I had paid him for the wash. He had refused the payment. I had left the cash on the dock cleat anyway. The marina lights had been turned on for the gala at 7 p.m. The string trio had started at 7:04 from Lebanon. There were 112 residents in cocktail attire on the deck and the floating boardwalk and the lawn. The catering staff was a small Manchester firm Heather had hired for the evening. The bar manager, a young woman named Stephanie, who would later become the permanent marina restaurant manager under the reopened operation, had been pouring champagne since 6:48. She did not know yet that her boss was about to change. She would find out at 7:23. Declan got out first, in a charcoal suit and the kind of tie he wore for federal court. Behind him came Trevor Olson, the marina manager, in a clean polo shirt with a nameplate that said Trevor, marina manager. Behind Trevor came Sergeant Lila Beaudry of the Coos County Sheriff's Office, Deputy Beaudry's older sister, in a brown uniform with her badge polished, present as a peace officer in case of incident, and not as a representative of the HOA's complaint. Behind Sergeant Beaudry came Patty Crandall, in a blue cardigan, carrying her banker's box. Heather McKinney saw us coming from the marina restaurant's outdoor deck. She was holding a champagne flute. She had 112 residents in cocktail attire on the deck and the floating boardwalk and the lawn. The string trio she had hired from Lebanon was playing Cole Porter. She set her champagne flute down on a high-top table. She walked toward us across her deck. She said, "Mr. Hargreaves, this is a private community event. I am going to ask you to leave." I said, "Mrs. McKinney, this is a private event on private property that, as of yesterday at 4:11 p.m., reverted to me by operation of the 2001 ground lease your association signed with my father. The lease was forfeited under Section 11.4, following your unwillingness to cure a documented material breach. The recorded affidavit and certificate of reversion is in Declan's briefcase. I will be happy to give you a copy. The string trio may continue playing. The bartender may continue serving the residents who would like to remain. You, however, are no longer the host of this event. I am. Heather McKinney stood there in her white linen dress. The string trio paused. She said, "Mr. Hargreaves, I am not going to be intimidated. I am the president of this community. I am hosting this gala on behalf of—" I said, "Mrs. McKinney, you are no longer the president of this community as it relates to this marina. You have not been since 4:11 p.m. on Friday. You may, of course, remain the president of your HOA. You may not, however, continue this gala on private property without my consent. I am declining to give you my consent. I am, however, granting consent to every resident present to stay as long as they would like. The bar is free for the next 2 hours. Trevor will be your point of contact. Please have a pleasant evening." The deck was silent for 15 seconds. Then Mrs. Adelaide Pullman, 83, the retired schoolteacher Heather had excluded from the Marina restaurant since 2022, said one sentence at full New Hampshire volume from her corner table. "Heather, sit down, or go home." Heather looked at Mrs. Pullman. She looked at the deck. She looked at me. She looked at Declan. She looked at Sergeant Beaudry, whose hands were clasped behind her back. She did not sit down. She did not go home immediately. She stood in the white linen dress on the marina deck for 41 more seconds, with the champagne flute back in her hand, looking around at the residents who had been her neighbors for 5 years. She looked at the Patterson-Jones family. She looked at Tim and Steve. She looked at Mrs. Pullman at the corner table. Nobody looked back at her. She set the champagne flute down on the high-top table for the second time that evening. She did not pick it up again. She went home. Sergeant Lila Beaudry walked her to the bottom of the marina ramp at 7:30 p.m. Lila did not speak to her. Lila kept her hands clasped behind her back. The white Lexus pulled out of the marina lot at 7:31 p.m. The string trio started Cole Porter again at 7:31:14. The bar opened to the public for the first time since 2022 at 7:33. Mrs. Adelaide Pullman ordered a martini. She did not pay for it. I had asked Trevor to ring her drinks to the Marina House account for the remainder of her life. She did not know that yet. She found out when she tried to pay at the end of the evening. She cried briefly. Her granddaughter, who had driven her to the gala, drove her home at 9:14 p.m. Tim and Steve, who had not been allowed inside the restaurant for 3 years, sat down at a foretop with the Patterson-Jones family at 7:47. I stood at the rail and watched the sun go down behind the granite ridge on the western shore. Declan stood beside me. He did not say anything for a long minute. Then he said, "Dad, Mom would be so proud of you right now." I said, "Declan, your mother would be losing her mind." He laughed for the first time since Bridget died. On the morning of day 31, at 3:47 a.m. on a Friday in late June, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun come up over Hargreaves Pond for the 18th time since I had moved back. The loons were calling on the far side. Murphy was asleep at my feet. The pontoon was tied to the dock. There was no boat on the water yet because the water was not yet warm enough. Declan came out at 4:51 a.m. in flannel pajamas with his Dunkin' coffee. He sat in the rocking chair beside me without speaking for 41 minutes. The mist on the eastern cove looked exactly the way Bridget had been trying to paint it the morning before she left for Casco Bay. I said, "Declan, your grandmother would have liked this morning." He said, "Dad, Mom would have too." We drove to Lancaster at 11:14 a.m. Marcus had flown in from Boston the previous evening and met us at the Registry of Deeds at noon. The affidavit of breach was signed in front of Mrs. Theron, the recorder, at 12:48 p.m. The certificate of reversion was time-stamped and entered into the Coos County Registry of Deeds at exactly 4:11 p.m., the same minute 23 years and 3 months earlier that the original ground lease had been entered into the same registry book. Marcus had timed the recording on his wristwatch. We drove home in 2 cars. The marina was, by 4:11 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, mine. Heather McKinney was indicted on July 14th by a Coos County grand jury on 6 counts: theft by deception, embezzlement, frivolous litigation in bad faith, and 3 counts of housing discrimination under the New Hampshire law against discrimination. She pleaded out in November to 4 counts. She drew 28 months in New Hampshire State Correctional, with the last 16 suspended on conditions, including full restitution of $148,000 to the HOA Reserve Fund, and a permanent ban on any officer position in any homeowners association in the state of New Hampshire for the remainder of her life. Brad McKinney pleaded out in federal court in October to 2 counts of wire fraud. He drew 22 months in federal custody and full repayment of the Birchwood Hospitality Management LLC siphoning. Brad's federal cooperation against his wife was credited in his sentencing. The Birchwood Cove Estates HOA recalled Heather by special election on June 11th. Patty Crandall was elected president. Patty's first act, on June 12th, was to walk to my farmhouse with a foil-covered pan of blueberry crumble her granddaughter had baked, and to ask if the HOA could enter into a new sublease of the marina from me at $1 a year on the same terms as the original lease, with one new clause added. I said, "Patty, what's the clause?" She said, "Colin, the clause is that any future president of this HOA, before being sworn in, must walk to your front porch and read out loud the original 1924 deed." I said, "Patty, the clause is accepted. I have been operating the Hargreaves Pond Marina as a Hargreaves family asset since June. I retained every member of the marina staff. I reduced slip fees for all residents over 65 to 0. I reopened the lakeside restaurant to the public 7 days a week. The Patterson Joneses come for Sunday brunch. Tim and Steve come for Wednesday burger night. Mrs. Adelaide Pullman has a standing reservation at the corner table every Friday at 6 p.m. for the rest of her natural life. I have also, with my son Declan's help, established a permanent Hargreaves Pond Conservation Trust, funded by 10% of the marina's annual net revenue, to support water quality monitoring, loon nesting habitat protection, and a summer fishing program for children of the Coos County School District who would not otherwise have access to a private lake. My daughter Maeve drove up from Portland the second weekend of August. She had not been to the farm since her mother died. She stood on the porch and cried for a long time. She walked down to the dock with me. She sat on the edge with her feet in the water. She said, "Dad, I want to bring Mom's painting back." I said, "Maeve, it's already on the easel in her old studio upstairs." She went up. She did not come back down for 2 hours. When she did come down, she had paint on her hands. She said, "Dad, she left it almost finished. I think I can finish it for her, the way she would have." She has been driving up every other Friday since. She works in Bridget's studio on Saturdays and Sundays. She is closer to finishing the painting than her mother was. The painting is a study of morning mist on the eastern cove at 5:47 a.m. The cove is the cove the marina sits on. The painting hangs, when Maeve is finished with it, in the new public entry of the marina restaurant. There is a small brass plaque under it. The plaque says Bridget Marguerite Cunliffe Hargreaves, 1959 to 2022. She loved this water. The first Hargreaves Pond Kids Fishing Day was held on July 27th. 41 children came. Trevor Olson taught them how to tie a Palomar knot. Declan ran the registration table. Mrs. Adelaide Pullman brought 4 trays of brownies. Patty Crandall served lemonade. Murphy, my old dog, slept under the bait table the entire day. I sat on the porch of my great-grandfather's farmhouse in the late afternoon and watched a 9-year-old girl from Berlin, New Hampshire, catch the first largemouth bass of her life off the new wooden dock my father had rebuilt in 1989. She held the base up. She looked at me across the water. She yelled, "Mr. Hargreaves, it's a big one." I yelled back, "Honey, they all are." If you have ever had an HOA Karen call the cops on you for using something you actually own, comment below with your state and what she said you weren't allowed to do. Read every one. Subscribe. Next week, a Florida widower, a 1972 Cadillac, and the HOA president who picked the wrong car. She picked the wrong Cadillac.
What Heather McKinney did not understand, and what most petty tyrants never understand, is that real authorities almost never looks like a white linen dress on a marina dock. It looks like a single sheet of paper in a file drawer in a Boston law office, drafted in March of 2001 by a young attorney whose father has told him a community is judged by how its treats its wicked neighbor. She thought a phone call to the sheriff was a weapon. He thought a phone call to his old firm was a weapon. The phone call to the firm wins, because Section 11.4 does not get angry, and Section 11.4 does not need to lift its voice. If an HOA has been leasing something from you, the first thing you should do tonight is pull the list and read it. The second thing is highlight the acceleration clause in yellow. The third is photograph it and email it to your attorney. The clause is in there. The clause is almost always in there. If this story hit home, drop your own HOA nightmare in the comments. Your state and the things she said you couldn't do on your own property. Subscribe. Next week, a Florida widower, a 1972 Cadillac, and the HOA president who picked the wrong car. See you on the next one.